In this tutorial, what we'll talk about are some of the different kinds of things that you can do inside After Effects to create a little bit of a aged or vintage look to your footage. I have a video clip here and it's already imported into my timeline. You can just go ahead and do that the way that you normally would, importing the footage, and then I usually just drag it down onto my little create a new composition icon here. And the way that we're going to make the adjustments to the footage is with adjustment layers. You can get those by going up to Layer and New, and you can see that there's an adjustment layer button there. The keyboard shortcut is listed there, the Alt Option Command Y. Or you can come down here and right click in the timeline and open New and Adjustment Layer, and you can see that it drops in. My preferences are set so that it fills the composition timeline, and it also starts at the beginning of my composition, and those are things you can obviously set in preferences. Here what we want to do is think about some of the different kinds of things that are qualities of vintage footage. And one of them is that saturation is usually shifted a little bit. Over time, the colors have lost their brightness, and so things are a little bit flatter. So we're going to come up to Effects and Presets, and we'll type in SAT for saturation, and you can see that there are a couple different options. We're going to choose the one under color correction here, and if I do hue and saturation and I drag it onto my adjustment layer, you can see that it pops up over here. Now as I add the different controls to my adjustment layers, what I also want to do is rename my layers so that I know what's what. One of the nice things about using the adjustment layers is that you can turn them on and off so that you know what is controlling what, and you can see the effect that everything's having, but also it just sort of helps to keep things organized. And the nice thing is too is that if you do it this way, then you have sort of a nice little guideline of adjustment layers, and you can drop any clips into it and it can make the same look work across multiple clips. Obviously the content of the clip is going to have an impact on the way that these kinds of things work. So if the adjustments that I make are not exactly what's going to work for yours, that's fine. But we'll give you kind of the basic idea. So the only thing that I really want to worry about with my hue and saturation effect here is the saturation. And I'm going to work with the master saturation. We'll take it down a bit there. We'll say down to 40. And I think I'll lighten it up just a little. Wash it out just a bit. And again, think of the effects of time and how everything happens that way. So once we've got the saturation layer done, what we want to do is think about the contrast. So I'm going to create another new adjustment layer, and we're going to bring in brightness and contrast. And brightness and contrast is a very simple effect, doesn't have a lot of parameters and doesn't have a lot of finesse. But for this, just to bring up a little bit of the darks and accent a few of the lights, we'll do that there. And maybe right around 10 or 12. We don't want to blow out too many of the highlights, but I feel like that's a pretty good look there. If I come down here to my adjustment layer, remember we can hit return and type in contrast. And if I create another adjustment layer and we'll hit return and type in curves, this is where we'll really start to see some of the vintage look happen. So I type in curve here, and again under color correction it pops in, and just drop it onto that adjustment layer, and then we have our parameters up here. And so there's a lot of different kinds of ways to work with curves. You can work with the channel as a whole, or you can work with the individual channels. We're going to do a little bit with the individual channels here. So if you think about the way that the vintage footage looks, usually there's a skewing of color, and those are the kinds of things that we're going to try to do here. So the curves work from darks to lights, and essentially, because of the way that video footage is created, we have some red values, some green values, and some blue values, and they all come together to create the full palette of color that we see in a regular piece of footage or a regular digital image. Whenever we're pulling away from one color, we're actually boosting another color, and we're going to accentuate that with the way that we're working with the overall look here. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to the reds, and with the reds what we want to do is boost the highlights and kind of pull back on some of the darker parts or the shadows of the piece. I like to put a number of points along the line. What this does is it gives you the chance to modify something without changing the whole line. So for my reds here, kind of push it up, and you can see how the lights are starting to pull pink. And if I drop the red down in the shadows, you can see that we're already starting to get that sort of aged look. And I'll just kind of smooth out my line here. All right, so now I'm going to go to green and do basically the same thing, but maybe with a little bit less of a push. So push the green highlights up a bit and pull the shadows down. And when I go to blue, basically by pushing up the greens and up the reds, I've pulled away the blues, but we want to emphasize that a little bit more. So basically we're going to do the opposite with our blues. So I'm going to pull the blues out of the highlights, and I'm going to push them up in the shadows. Again, just try to create. Usually the difference in the midtones is created sort of automatically between the 2 points, but it's nice to have the chance to just kind of look and see, you know, what's the best look for the way that your footage kind of sits on the screen. All right, so just to again see the difference that we're making, we'll go back to the original footage. You can see there's just that little bit of aging so far. Maybe we'll pull the blues just a little bit more. And we can always go back in and modify it. That's the great thing about how this all works. Everything's very flexible. So the next thing that we want to do is think about, you know, what are the other kind of properties of vintage footage, and one of them is that the edges are usually fairly soft, like things start to lose their sharpness over time as well. So we'll create another adjustment layer, and this one we're going to call blur. So now we have our blur adjustment layer, and if we open up blur in effects and presets, we can take a look. There's certainly a lot of different kinds of options. I'm just going to use fast blur. It renders quickly. By the time we get done with this, it's going to have enough trouble rendering as it is, but just to kind of soften things, fast blur is a nice little simple way to go. So we're going to just take that and drag it onto the adjustment layer. And you can see here that we've got some different options for our settings. We can do horizontal and vertical with the way that we're working. We want that, but you could switch it to the others if you wanted a different type of effect. And this repeat edge pixels here is very important, and we'll show you why by increasing the blurriness without checking this first. If I slide up the blurriness, and again, we're going to be able to make the change so that we don't have this throughout the picture in just a moment, but just to show you the value of repeat edge pixels, if you look around the edge here, and if I use the space bar to kind of navigate in, and we'll enlarge up to 100%, you can see that there's an edge that's, you know, it could be distracting depending on what's happening around the edge of your frame. But if I switch from, and we'll just kind of move it over here as we zoom in. If we switch from no repeat edge pixels to repeat edge pixels, you can see that that kind of darkening artifact that was happening around the edge goes away. And that's because repeat edge pixels talks After Effects into pushing the blur essentially to the edge of the frame and a bit beyond. Now 17, value of 17 for our blurriness is certainly more than we need it to be. We'll fit the image back into our frame. We just want to soften the edge. And maybe a value of 7 is something that's going to work well here. Now, obviously, we don't want to have the center of the image as soft, and or at least I think that. But you can see how it does give a certain look and age to the footage that we're working with. So if I have my adjustment layer selected and I click on the pen tool, I can create a mask that essentially controls where the softening is going to be at its most intense and where it's going to be at its softest. So we'll just kind of blow things out there. And here you can see I'm just kind of adding some Bezier handles. And it really depends on the type of footage that you're looking for. Now here you can see that now the blurriness is contained simply within the little mask that I've created. If I come down to blur and I drill down into masks, we can do this a couple ways. If I switch from add to subtract, now the blurriness is going around the outside of the image. But you can see it's a very harsh delineation between the soft and the sharp. So that's where feather comes in. And if we feather this look, it's going to give us a nice sort of gentle kind of push. And if we go back to our regular selection tool, keyboard shortcuts V, and if I select off of it, you can see where the separation, it starts to push the soft towards the outside there. And if we want to see the effect of this again, we can click on and off. And if you want, even more of softening, you can push that out too. But it really just depends on what kind of look you're going for, and what kind of depth of field you had in your original shot. But maybe we'll dial it back there a little bit. And certainly, I'm kind of working in the middle of my composition. We've got a baseball player here, but you do want to make sure that whatever you choose for your you can see the camera didn't quite keep up with him. Whatever you choose as your frame that will keep the sharpness is going to be what you want to be in focus, comparatively speaking. But this is, of course, the mask can be animated over time. So if that's something that you want to change, you can. But usually it's something that kind of just sticks into place.